Usually for the Mishna class, I say good morning, but I missed this morning. So therefore, I'll say good evening. We are learning Mishnayos Erevin, Parak Tes, chapter 10, Parak Yud, chapter 10, Mishnah Tes, Mishnah 9. Again, I apologize for missing this morning. Lo Yamad Adam Bershus Hayachid, a person may not stand in a private domain, the Yiftach Bershus Harabim, and open a door in the public domain. This is the case goes like this. You're in your house, private domain, and you're sticking your hand out to the street, which is the public domain. There's a key there on the floor. You're going to pick up the key and then open the door that faces outside. That's how you're doing it. So you are standing in the private domain. You're in a private domain, and you're moving something in the public domain. That should sound familiar. We discussed like that before, about standing in one domain and moving something in another domain. But here it says you can't do it. Or Bershus Harabim v'yiftach Bershus Hayachid. Or let's say the other case the way around. You are standing in the Bershus around the public domain, and you're sticking your hand into the private domain and opening the door that's facing inside. Mishnah says you can't do it, which is different than what we had before, because this is a dissenting opinion to that what we had previously. Previously, the Mishnah said, without any dissenting opinion, that you can be in one domain and move something in another domain. And here we're going to see the opinion that says otherwise. In the case of where you're standing in the public domain and moving something in the private domain, if you make a wall 10 tefachim high, 10 fists high, that's considered a halachic wall. And if you make such a wall that now where you're standing in the public domain is walled off, so now you're in a private domain, then it's not a problem moving the key in the private domain, because you're in a private domain and the key's in a private domain. Divrei Rebbe Meir, these are the words of Rebbe Meir. So Rebbe Meir is the opinion that says you cannot be standing in one domain and moving something in another domain. And the reason is because we are concerned that if you're doing that, you may actually bring the object from the domain where it is into the domain where you are, and that would then constitute haitzah, transferring Torah prohibition. That's Rebbe Meir. That means Rebbe Meir disagrees with what we said before, that you can stand in one domain and move in something in another domain. Amrulai. So now the sages went ahead, and now the sages responded to him. The sages are going to be arguing on him. They're the opinion of the previous Mishnahs that said you could do this. And in order to understand what they're going to say to Rebbe Meir, we have been discussing until now the case that we're talking about has been where, let's say, you're in the private domain and the object's in the public domain, or you're in the public domain and the object's in the private domain. But Rebbe Meir would say the same thing if, let's say, you'd be in the private domain and the key or the object is in what we call a carmelis. As we mentioned many times before, a carmelis is an area that is not, from the Torah's viewpoint, a private domain. It's not a public domain. There will really be no problem moving things in it or from it or to it. But the rabbi said, no, this is rabbinically an area that you have to be consider. In respect to a private domain, it's considered a public domain. In respect to a public domain, it's considered a private domain. And therefore, because it resembles both, the rabbi said we got to treat it as both regarding the other. We've got to treat it as both. Therefore, the same way Rebbe Meir says you cannot be standing in a public domain, move something in a private domain. You can't be standing in a carmelis and move something in a private domain. Be the same thing. And because of that, the sages responded to Rebbe Meir and showed him how people acted not like the way he said. And that's enough of a proof to show that, that we are correct in saying that you can't. Amrulai, they said to him, Maaseh b'shuk shal patamin shar b'Yushalayim. It happened in the marketplace of patamin, means for those who fatten animals, butchers, in the butcher's market. That was in Yushalayim. That they used to lock the door, and leave the key in the window that it was on top of the doorway. I'm assuming this is when they were, I don't know what they were doing at the butcher shop on Shabbos. It could very well be that they stayed basically until Shabbos began. And it seems like maybe they were there a little bit later than usual. And they were locking up. And what did they do? So they were standing outside. They were standing in the street. They locked the door, and then they put the key on top of a ledge, a window or a ledge that was above the door. That's what they did. Now, let's see, was that okay to do on Shabbos? And this was done, and apparently was done, they're quoting it as being done in a way that you see that it was permissible to do. These people wouldn't have done it if it wasn't permissible to do. So let's analyze it. They're standing in the street in Yerushalayim. Is that a public domain? So interestingly, Yerushalayim, any street in Yerushalayim was not considered a public domain. Because number one, Yerushalayim had a wall around it. And number two, its doors, meaning to get into the city, would be closed at night. That means there was never a time where basically the streets were open from one end of the city to the other. At night, they used to close the doors to the city. If that's what happens, then it's not a public domain according to Torah law. So what is it? It's a Carmelis. It's a rabbinic public domain. Okay. So they're standing in the street, standing outside the store. Then and the key was on the floor. Why was the key on the floor in this case? I'm not sure. Maybe it just fell on the floor, or that's where it landed up. The key was on the floor. The key was on the floor, picked up the key, and they locked the door. Now, anything wrong with that? Anything wrong with the fact that they are standing in a Carmelis and now putting it in the door? It's now resting in the door. What status does the door have? Well, the door, the keyhole was higher than 10 tefachim off the ground, 10 fists off the ground. That means it was not within the airspace of Rosh Hashanah. What status did that area have? The answer is it's a Makim P'tur. It's a place of exemption. As we mentioned, an area that is going to be an airspace that's going to be 10 fists, 10 tefachim up the ground is not the public domain, and it's not a Carmelis either. It's a Makim P'tur. To be a Carmelis, it has to be on the ground, less than 10 tefachim off the ground, and 4x4. You don't have those dimensions here. So the kio was really a Makim P'tur. It's really a place of exemption. There was no problem taking the key from the Carmelis and sticking it into the keyhole. It's a Makim P'tur. Now, then they took it out of the keyhole. Then after that, they took it out of the keyhole, and they put it onto the windowsill, whatever it may have been. That ledge was considered a Reshus Hayachid, a private domain. So they were going from a Makim P'tur, a place of exemption, to Reshus Hayachid. Not a problem either. But according to Reb Meir, at the end of the day, you should have a problem that you're standing in the Carmelis. You now are handling something in the private domain. Why aren't we afraid that you're going to bring it to yourself? How could they have done it? It's a proof, not like Reb Meir, that we're not concerned in those kind of situations that you're going to do it. Rabbi Yossi says, Shuk Shal Tzamarim Haya. That is actually, he's just, if we're talking about what the story was, it wasn't the butcher's market, it was the Tzamarim, it was the wool merchant's market that this took place. He felt important to clarify the story. But the point is, wherever the story took place, it's a proof that we're taught that against Reb Meir. It's a proof that you wouldn't be able to stand in one domain and move something else in another domain. Have a wonderful day, a wonderful evening.